This is a 1998 Lamborghini Diablo SV, and it's an iconic exotic car. V12 power, gated manual transmission, and those giant letters down the side. This thing is amazing, and today I'm going to review it and show you all of its quirks and features. Before I get started, big news, this Diablo SV is currently for sale and it's being auctioned live on Cars and Bids. Like I said, V12 power, gated manual transmission, and the SV is tremendously rare and super desirable, and you can buy this one on Cars and Bids. So, once you finish watching this video, click the link in the description below to visit the live auction for this Diablo SV, where you can bid on it and buy it only on Cars and Bids. All right, time for the quirks and features of the Diablo SV. There are many, but we'll begin with the key, which doesn't have a little hole for you to attach it to your keyring. Instead, it has a custom keyring that wraps around the center of the key, and then you attach that part to your keyring. This is how all the Diablo keys are. It made absolutely no sense. Why didn't they just make the key like everyone else? That's just the weirdness of this car. There's a lot of that, so stick around. The other obvious big quirk of the SV is, well, the letters SV are written on the side in about 5 foot long giant print so that everybody can see it as it drives down the street. What exactly is going on there? Well, let's start with a basic overview of this car. The Lamborghini Diablo came out in the early 1990s as Lamborghini's flagship mid-engine V12 powered car, and it lasted all through the 90s. Now, when the Diablo first came out, it had 485 horsepower from its V12 and rear-wheel drive. But throughout the 90s, it evolved. It eventually added more power and all-wheel drive. This version, the SV, as you can see, came out in '95, and it was supposed to be a high-performance version of this high-performance car. SV stood for Super Veloce, which means super fast. And to celebrate the super fastness, they printed it like this in massive print on the side. Now, like I said, the Diablo had added all-wheel drive, but the SV was supposed to be about more power and less weight. So this car has 510 horses from the V12, up from the base model's 485, and although the standard Diablo had all-wheel drive when this came out, the SV went back to rear-wheel drive for a more pleasurable, basic driving experience. Now, the SV actually added a lot more than just a little power and some giant writing on the side. For one, it had bigger brakes compared to other Diablo models. Again, it was the high-performance version, more power, so it had more brakes. And it also got larger brake cooling ducts in the front. You can see them at the very lowest part of the front lip spoiler. These are bigger than other Diablo models, and that's a little subtle way that you can tell it apart, as if you needed any more guidance. Now, the SV also had these roof scoops to bring air into the engine, a very cool look that was distinctive to this car and also to the Diablo SE30 Yota. That was the high-performance version of the earlier special edition Diablo. It got a little complicated, but that also had the hood scoops, and then this added it too. Very cool feature of the SV. There were some other little upgrades as well. For instance, all the SV models have black in the back surrounding the taillights and the grille. In this car, since it's a black car, it's harder to tell, but that was a distinctive feature of the SV. And the SV also got special wheels, as you can see. Silver along the outside, black painted in the middle, and that SV logo again appears on one spoke on each one of the wheels. And then, of course, if that SV logo wasn't enough, SV. Actually, I joke about the giant SV on the side, but the truth is it's become a very special element of this car. I remember when these came out, I was a kid and I thought that the giant lettering was pretty tacky at the time. But now, as it's aged, it's really become a distinctive feature of the Diablo, and in particular, of course, the SV. And I think part of the reason these cars are so desired, not just for their performance, but because this is so cool and special and crazy, the giant lettering down the side. But anyway, on to the many other quirks. Now, one of the Diablo's most distinctive quirks and features is, of course, the doors. They're scissor doors, as you can see. They go up, pioneered by the Countach, and also used here in the Diablo. And to open them up, you walk up to the car, and there's a little place where you put your hand to pull on them, and then a spot where you put your thumb to unlatch the door, and then you pull it up and climb inside from there. And once you get inside this car, you see kind of an interesting hodgepodge of very cool and very quirky Italian. Let's start with the cool. Open the door and you can see carbon fiber trim on the door sill, which indicates the special car you're getting into. Same deal in the center control stick. You can see carbon fiber trim like a high performance car should have. You also get a gated manual transmission, which looks cool and of course adds to the high performance fun of this car, and some very neat sport seats. You can see one-piece leather seats that definitely hold you in place, keep you here. They look good, they feel good, they're neat, and they certainly belong in a high-performance car like this one. And in the headrest, you can see stitched in there is the SV graphic from the outside, plus the Lamborghini Bull logo. So there's a lot of cool stuff in this car, but then the weirdness starts to catch your eye. We begin with the steering wheel, which doesn't look very high performance car at all. In fact, it looks like something you would see in an economy car or perhaps a racing arcade game. That's your factory Diablo steering wheel. But even funnier, over on the passenger side, the dashboard has like a wart on it that sticks way out from, well, the rest of the dashboard. That's because of the airbag. This car was built when airbag regulations were coming into place. It had to have driver and passenger. So the steering wheel is ugly because the driver airbag is inside. The dashboard looks weird because that's how Lamborghini fitted an airbag. They didn't even try to make it fit with the rest of the dashboard design. They just stuck it on extra, and that's what you got. But there are many weird touches in this interior beyond just that stuff. How about this unlabeled group of buttons that says 1, 2, 3, 4 with some arrows? What does that do? The answer is it controls the suspension firmness. If you want a firm ride for high performance sporty driving, you can do that, or you can dial it to a softer setting for a more comfortable ride. Doesn't tell you that's what it does, but that's what it does. Now, you move over from there and you have your power window switches, as you can see, and there's a suspension control switch here too. For some reason, in a completely different outline as the power window switches, even though it's the same size. Totally different trim, but they wanted to accentuate that suspension switch. And there are many unusual controls in this car. We move next to the climate control panel, which is absolutely bizarre. First, the font they've selected for the words climate control looks like an 80s digital clock font. Have no idea why they did that, but they did. Over on the other side, on the opposite panel, the Lamborghini logo seems sort of randomly placed in there, but they've placed it there. Now, this whole climate control panel was lifted out of late Countach models. They also kept it through the Diablo, apparently, and it included this little button for recirculating air inside of an outline of a car that looks like a Lamborghini with the wedge shape. That's pretty cool. You also had a little button here to change between Celsius and Fahrenheit. And when you tap it, you can see it instantly changes the temperature readout from Celsius to Fahrenheit with just a simple push of a button. That was a nice convenience feature, which unfortunately they didn't offer in the speedometer. This car was sold new in the United States. It's always been in the United States, and yet the odometer is in kilometers. That's because all Lamborghini Diablo and Countach models have their odometer in kilometers, even if they were sold in the United States or the United Kingdom, two countries that use miles for measuring distance. They didn't offer this car with a mile odometer. Instead, you just had to do the calculation if you wanted to know how many miles you had. They didn't bother making the change. The funny thing was the speedometer is in miles per hour. So they did the change for the speedometer, just not the odometer. You had to DIY that and figure out your mileage for yourself. But anyway, back to the weird and quirky controls in this car, and back to the strange center control stack. I love this bizarre hodgepodge of buttons. So on the upper left here, you have your light controls, fog lights, rear and front fog light. Now also along the top, you can see the control for the parking lights, but in between the light controls, there's this dot. What is that? Nothing. That's a blank switch. It has no effect. You can't do anything with it. You can't push it. It's just a blank. Why didn't they put the parking lights next to the other two light controls? I have no idea. Instead, they're separated by a random blank switch. It gets even weirder in the controls down below. This one here on the left turns on the dome light, which is especially odd because there is a switch on the dome light that you can use to turn on the dome light. But if you don't want to reach for that switch, you can turn it on in the center control stack. Now, the next button here is a key that locks the doors. You want to unlock the doors, well, it's a separate button and it's not next to the lock button. Instead, you got to move two over. This button with a door and a raised lock is the unlock button. In between them is the fuel door button. So you have lock, fuel door, and then unlock. They didn't put them next to each other. I have no idea why, but that was Lamborghini in this era. And it wasn't just the controls in this car that were weird and unusual. The gated manual shifter, one of this car's biggest selling points, is odd because it's a dog leg, which means that first is down and to the left. And when you shift into second, you go up and to the right. It's a 5-speed manual, and reverse occupies the up left position that first gear usually has in other cars' manual transmissions. The warning lights in this car are unusual. They're not integrated into the gauge cluster like in a lot of cars. Instead, they're primarily above the gauge cluster in this separate little area that they've reserved for warning lights. But then there are more warning lights below in the traditional spot in the gauge cluster. You have two different levels of warning lights. Another interesting item in here is the seat belts, which do not come out from the side by the door like in basically every other car. Instead, you pull out the seat belts from the center. So they go over your right shoulder and clip in on your left next to the door, which is very unorthodox, but it's the way that it was. And speaking of the seats, an interesting item behind the seats, you have little storage cubbies, but accessing them was a problem because the seats are one piece. They don't fold forward. So to access the storage cubby, you would actually have to move the entire seat forward, slide it forward, and then you can get to your storage cubby. But then you get in the car and you have to fiddle with the seat to get it back into the position where you wanted it. Now you'll also notice another interesting item next to the driver's seat back here. This is a battery kill switch, and you can see it's Lamborghini branded, so I guess this car came with it from the factory. You can turn off the battery, shut the car down completely if you don't plan on driving it for a period of time. One other interesting item, in addition to the dome light that I already showed you, there was also a reading light, and the operation is fantastic. You turn it on, and then you can move it around. It's sort of on a swivel, on a ball, and you can move it to driver or passenger. I guess this was an alternative to putting in two reading lights, one for driver, one for passenger. Instead, they gave you one, and you can move it wherever you want to. But next up, we climb out of the Diablo, which is actually pretty simple. You have this latch on the door, exactly where you'd expect it. You pull on it, it unlatches the door, and then you sort of push up, and then you climb out of the scissor door. And speaking of opening stuff, the engine lid, the engine cover, is especially easy to open because you don't actually have to get into the car in order to do it. Instead, you just walk up and there's two latches. You can see right here, there's one on each side, left and right. You just undo the two latches and then it's unlatched and you can open up the engine cover completely from the outside of the car, lift it up, and then you can see the engine, the glorious, absolutely massive Lamborghini V12. They used this engine for decades, from the 1960s all the way to the Aventador. This was the V12 that Lamborghini used with various tweaks and updates over the years, but the same basic overall design. Pretty impressive. Again, in this car, a 5.7-liter V12, about 510 horsepower. It looks good, it's very cool, it's huge, and I especially love that in the Diablo they print the firing order of the cylinders directly there on the engine. That has become a Lamborghini hallmark, and I think they still do it on their cars to this day. It originated with the Diablo. It looks very cool, seeing the order at which all 12 cylinders light up. And of course, the Raging Bull graphic is there as well. And we're not done opening up stuff in the Diablo just yet. Next, we got the front compartment, which opens in a pretty obvious way. There's a latch in the driver's footwell. You pull on that, you come over here, you unlatch it, you lift it up, and you can see this is the storage compartment in this car. And frankly, it's surprisingly large, actually, considering how low-slung, wedge-shaped, and exotic the Diablo is. It has a fairly decent amount of cargo space where you can store your bags. Now you can also see the stereo system in here is badged as the Alpine V12, which seems only fitting for the V12 Lamborghini. You also have in here 2 leather bags that are branded Lamborghini, secured in place by leather straps. These contain a jack and a toolkit in order to do roadside tire changes or other roadside repairs to your Lamborghini Diablo. And still on the subject of opening up stuff, another hallmark of most Diablo models was pop-up headlights. You can see right now the headlights are off, which means they're down and you don't see them. But you turn the headlights on and whoop, they pop right up to say hello, and then they illuminate your path forward. Again, when you want to turn them off, they're off. And of course, you can play with them up and down, which is a cool touch of this car and a lot of other sports cars from this era. And speaking of lighting, we move around to the back of the Diablo, where you see the brake light and the turn signal, which is actually just a generic part that was used in a lot of different vehicles. The Diablo, but also buses, and all sorts of other cars that just needed compliant lighting, they used these. It's surprising to see them on such a distinctive, crazy, exotic car, just these generic rear lights. Now, other than that, nothing about the rear was generic. You had the Diablo badge back here, of course, and it also says SV in the font one more time. And the word Lamborghini is written out on the rear lid and actually imprinted into a little spot on the rear lid specifically designed for this badge that says Lamborghini, which is kind of cool to see. Now, in this area, you will also notice the rear wing, the big old rear wing, which was standard on the SV cars, and interestingly has a flap at the very end that looks like it's adjustable. So if you wanted to change your downforce to maximize your Diablo SV performance on the racetrack, I suppose you could do that by adjusting the flap, if you would notice such changes. Now, another thing you'll notice around back is the giant center exit exhaust. Right in the middle, very obviously placed, and of course, it sounds fantastic. Take a listen to a couple of revs from the Diablo SV. Yes, that's impressive, but one sound that's disappointing from this car is the horn. It doesn't have the old school Italian air horn that so many exotic cars from this period had. Instead, it's a boring, generic, regular horn. Take a listen. Now, one other interesting thing about the Diablo around back, there's no trunk back here, no extra storage compartment. I bring that up because in the Countach, the panel that the wing is mounted on lifts up and reveals a surprisingly sizable trunk. But in this car, no, your only storage compartment is up front. There's no additional rear trunk. One other item worth mentioning is this little badge over on the side, only on the passenger side, that says designed by Marcello Gandini. Gandini, of course, designed the Countach, the Miura, and many other iconic cars. He recently died, but he left his mark in the car world and on this Diablo with his signature on this badge, which is a very cool touch, although a little bit controversial because he designed early prototypes of the Diablo, but not the eventual production car. Nonetheless, that's his name and signature, and it's a very cool badge to celebrate a very talented car designer. All right, driving the Diablo SV. Now this is cool. It has been a little while since I've driven a Diablo. I did a review of a Diablo GT, the race car, GTR, about 1.5 years ago, and I did a 6.0 a long time before that. I haven't driven many Diablos, but I've always thought they were so cool looking, and this is certainly that. Now, the first thing I noticed when I get in this car, and I have a great frame of reference because I own a Countach. So the first thing I notice is it is a lot more refined than the Countach, which is funny because refinement is not something that you would put on a Diablo typically, but it's a lot more refined than the Countach. Now, there are pros and cons to that, right? The Countach is cool in part because it's just so brash and ridiculous and unrefined and loud. This car, you know, starts very easily because it's fuel injected. It goes into gear a lot easier. The clutch is a lot easier. The ride is a lot smoother, but the result of that is it feels a little bit more luxury, a little bit less like crazy, hard-edged, absolutely insane car. Nonetheless, it is still a pretty insane car. It is nice to drive, I will say. Now, the ride surprisingly isn't really so bad. I have a suspicion that the suspension on this particular Diablo is in pretty nice shape because it's not loud, it's not rough, the ride is pretty nice. This car feels like it's pretty tight in that area. There is some interior creaking and rattling, which I don't have in my Countach. I attribute that to, you know, the 90s came, late 80s, 90s came, plastic started to come into cars a lot more than before, where it was a lot of leather stuff. And a lot of the creaking I hear is door panel plastic, seat back, you know, that kind of situation where plastic is a little bit more commonly used, let's just say. I am really impressed with like the ride quality and just how much more refined this feels than the Countach. It feels like relatively calm and stable and cool and collected. I'm really, honestly, truly surprised by just how not bad it is. And it still feels pretty hard-edged and pretty exciting. And a lot easier, especially to operate the clutch and pedals. That's the big thing in the Countach that I think is challenging. Heavy clutch pedal and the shifter situation is heavy. In this car, everything is just a lot lighter and a lot more user-friendly. I would say the Diablo feels, at least this one, feels a lot more towards the Murcielago than it does feel towards my Countach. Now, it's worth pointing out that this is a later iteration of the Diablo. You know, Diablo came out in '92. This is a '98, and it was sold through O2. So this is a later one in the later half of production. I have driven early Diablos. They definitely feel more Countach-like. All right, giving it some gas here. Oh, that sound is excellent. Oh, that sounds amazing, yeah! That is excellent. Absolutely excellent. Amazing V12 roar. That is so, so cool. That is absolutely wonderful. Oh, how lovely. And it's fast. Again, in comparison to the Countach, this definitely feels a lot faster. I always kind of figured the Diablo would be more Countach-y, and actually it's really not. It's quite a sweetheart car to drive with a good shifter and clutch. Oh, yeah. Oh! Wow. Excellent. The steering isn't the most communicative. When power steering started to show up, a lot of the exotic automakers adopted it, of course, as they should have, but the drawback was they were still kind of figuring it out, and a lot of the early power steering exotic cars, it was just over boosted. And it's kind of the case of this car too. The Countach has manual steering, and at low speeds, that means a lot of effort to turn the wheel. But when you're actually going, the result is, you know, it's very direct. And this car is definitely not quite on that same level in terms of directness. What a beast. This car is so exciting to drive. I'm really surprised at how easy the clutch and shifter is to operate and drive well and drive fast. The handling in this car is quite nice. It's fairly flat. It's a small car. It corners reasonably well. This is something I also like about the Countach that I don't think gets enough praise with that car or with this. People get so mixed up and excited about the styling of the Diablo and the Countach, they often don't really talk about the steering and handling capabilities. And this car really does feel like it handles quite well. The engine's in the middle, it's got really good balance. It really feels like a well-balanced, well-positioned car. And when you go around corners, there's not much body roll, there's a lot of predictability, and I haven't felt too much lightness in the front end. That is a little bit of a Countach issue. It's certainly an issue in the Miura. If I drove this car harder and faster on some real back roads, I suspect it would probably show itself, but maybe not as much. But regardless, I am surprised at just how well this car handles. This is actually a pretty damn good overall package as a car, which I wasn't expecting. You know, so many people think these cars are so compromised, and in a lot of ways they are, but if your frame of reference is a Countach and you just want to enjoy something that's very special, this car is very special, and it really is a treat to drive. Feels more modern and easier and more fun and more exciting to drive than I really was expecting. Quite nice. And so that's the Lamborghini Diablo SV. Wow, this is a truly thrilling car to look at, to think about, and surprisingly to me, to drive. I love this car. The world loves this car, and you can buy this one on Cars and Bids. Anyway, now it's time to give the Diablo SV a DougScore. And the DougScore is here, 58 out of 100, which places the Diablo SV here against some other relevant cars, including several other versions of the Lamborghini Diablo. Truthfully, I didn't have high expectations going into this drive. The SV looks amazing, but I didn't expect it to drive so well. The Diablo 6.0 drives even better, but it loses some of the hard-edged charm of the earlier models. I think the SV really might be the sweet spot of the overall Diablo lineup. Just enough old-school crazy Lamborghini, just enough modern, rational Lamborghini. I loved it.